Happy Friday, Midsummer viewers. That's right, I'm sticking with it. So in order to satisfy my deep love of history, as I mentioned before, I read a lot of nonfiction. And I am a giant fan of Erik Larson and anyone who writes creative nonfiction in that same way. So you can check out Dead Wake and Devil in the White City, two of my personal favorites by Erik Larson. Now, let me talk about Radium Girls by Kate Moore. I loved this story. So let me set the scene. It's 1917 and clockmakers are using radium, which glows, to make luminous clock faces. And these were extremely popular because everybody wanted to be able to see what time it was in the middle of the night. It was a novel invention at that time. So they were hiring, these companies were hiring women in their early 20s and their late teens to work in their factories and be dial painters. It was a very coveted position because these women were making almost $20 a week, which is insane for a time period when people were lucky to make $5 a week. So it was a very coveted job in this time. And so these women were revered as like fabulous, and that's awesome. Let me tell you my first thought. So these women were using radium. Now, I had to remember that radium had only been discovered by the Curies in 1898. But, as Moore points out in her book, it was as early as 1901 that the harmful qualities of radium were discovered. So this is like almost 20 years after that, at least 17 years after that and beyond, that these women were painting dials with radium and they had no protection. And in fact, they were told that radium was good for them. In order to explain how these women were exposed to radium in such a direct way, I brought my handy dandy paintbrush because they were instructed to dip their paintbrush in the radium, twist it in their mouth to make it a fine point, and then paint on the dial. And then they would do this over and over again, putting radium directly into their mouths and into their bloodstream. And they were doing this up to 20 years after the harmful effects of radium were discovered. WTF, dudes. Seriously, that is messed up. And the best part, I think, for me is I don't want to focus too much on the companies themselves because they're straight up dicks. And the women in this story will capture your heart and your imagination. So the first women that you meet in the narrative are the women from the New Jersey plant of the United States Radium Corporation. Bad United States Radium Corporation. Bad. These women suffered so much. There was Catherine Shaw, Albina Maggia, Edna Hussman, Grace Fryer, and Quinta Maggia. These were the first of those who had suffered that actually brought up a lawsuit. And this pretty much started a workers' compensation revolution. It changed the way all of us are treated on the job with work and safety regulations, and especially for compensation from occupational poisoning, because that's exactly what was happening. What's incredible to me is, as a history nerd, I had never heard of this happening, ever. We don't teach this in U.S. history in high schools. We learn about the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory, which, yes, was also a giant tragedy, and did also change safety regulations for workers. And this was at the exact same time period. That was in 1918, and this is in 1917 through the 20s and the 30s, and these women were suffering. So why do we learn about one and not the other? Just a question I have for my history teachers. So big business kept claiming they had nothing to do with the sicknesses that these women were coming down with. They were having honeycombed bones. Their teeth were falling out, never healing. They were developing sarcomas and developing severe anemia and so many complications from radiation poisoning. But the companies refused to acknowledge that this was a problem or that it was an occupational disease. They kept saying it was diphtheria or syphilis and pneumonia. These are things that are actually on death certificates of these women who suffered from radium poisoning. And that's just, it breaks my heart. So I don't understand how these men slept at night. So the other company, besides the United States Radium Corporation, was Radium Dial, which was in Ottawa, Illinois. And the women there brought their lawsuit much later than those in New Jersey, but only because their symptoms didn't show up as quickly. So Catherine Donahue, Charlotte Purcell, Marie Rossiter, and Pearl Payne all joined together to sue Radium Dial, who again knew that their workers were radioactive because they had been doing their own studies of these women ever since the New Jersey trials and keeping the results to themselves, knowing that these women were going to be slowly dying of radium poisoning. Really, guys? Why? You're heartless. And this creative nonfiction book has not only changed my perspective on history in general, but it brought me to tears multiple times. We hear the story through these women's actual words. Catherine Schaub actually published a book on her ordeal. We have newspaper clippings and everything from the Catherine Donahue trial in Illinois. It's so heartbreaking. These are the women that suffered for us to have the Occupational Safety and Health Administration, OSHA. And I'm sure in your jobs you've heard of OSHA because it's a big deal now. And I want to thank Kate Moore for writing this story and bringing it to my attention, if not everyone else who reads it, because it's absolutely heart-wrenching. But it's so great to think that these strong-willed, kick-butt women kept fighting. They were given a death sentence and they kept fighting so our generations could be safer in the workplace and not repeat these same mistakes. So thank you, Kate Moore. Grab a copy of the Radium Girls now. It's so good. You won't regret it. History nerds, this is something you don't want to miss. So I want to thank Catherine, Charlotte, Marie, Pearl, other Catherine, Edna, Albina, Quinta, and Grace, and all those other women whose names have been forgotten by history and who were never given the justice they deserve. So, 5 bards to the Radium Girls by Kate Moore.